Going to make a deeper dive video on builds and how to make them. I'm having to redo this video, mostly because my dumbass was being lazy and just assumed that critical hit, hit chance, and heavy attack chance were the same stat-wise as most other games. They are not. So I spent an hour doing a deep dive into builds that I cannot get back because I was being too lazy to actually look up the info on them. So unfortunately, now I have to redo that. But here's what you need to know. This is a deep dive into builds and how to make them. So first of all, we need to look at stat points. Stat points are the biggest possible thing for your build because they all affect base damage right here. Okay, so your strength, dexterity, wisdom, perception, and fortitude. As you can see, I take a point out of fortitude, lowers my base damage. Take a point out of perception, lowers my base damage. Wisdom, same thing. Dexterity, same thing. Strength, same thing. And you can fiddle with that on your own. You can see, what the actual numbers are. But that base damage number right there, most important possible thing for your build. If you're a tank, that determines how much you can block. If you're a healer, it determines how much you can heal. If you're a damage dealer, especially, that determines how much damage you're dealing. Okay? So, to focus on the stats just for a minute, if you're a tank, you're going to want to spec mostly into strength and fortitude, because that's where you're getting all of your resistances, endurances, defense, evasion, health, all that kind of stuff. It's very important to have high health on a tank. I'm a damage character, so I'm not speccing into that, I'm just telling you. So you're going to try to get that strength up to probably 60, maybe even 70, just because as a tank you really need the defenses and the health, okay? Same with fortitude. You're going to want to get that 30 is the baseline, because that gives you 100 endurance. Depending on your build, you could maybe go higher, but I would really only recommend maybe going to 30 for fortitude. Okay, but after that, it's going to be wisdom. Okay, for tanks, for healers, and for any support characters, generally speaking. Since you're not focused on dealing damage, you want to have enough cooldown speed and bonuses to your buffs and stuff like that, so you're not running out of magic, so you can always cast your taunts to keep the boss focused on you. You can always cast your healing to keep the group members alive, things like that. So back to tanks though. So after you have your resistances set up where they need to be, you're going to want to spec mostly into wisdom. You don't need to put 60 points in like I do, but you're going to try to get it to at least 50. 50 is the goal. You don't need to put more than 50 as a tank. You just want to have the cooldown speed, which gives you the ability to cast. So every ability you have in this game has a cooldown. Increase the cooldown speed means that ability is able to be cast more often. You're in the cooldown less. That's very good because that means you can cast your taunts and your heals and things like that more often. So as a tank, that's very important, especially with mobs, because you're going to have to cast taunt after taunt if mobs are running around or when you're trying to group them, things like that, or if the group's going silly. So then after that, it's going to be dexterity, because that's going to increase your crits. So again, that's heals and damage. It's going to help you keep aggro, stuff like that. Because the more you attack, especially with abilities that gain aggro. So if there's not a tank generating aggro, the boss is going to go to whoever is dealing the most damage. So as a tank, it's just better to deal as much damage as you can, but of course that's not the priority for a tank. So after you get your resistances and your wisdom set up, then you're going to spec into dexterity. Perception isn't really all that useful. I mean, it is to a certain degree, but not really for a tank as much. It's mostly going to be your strength and fortitude, then your wisdom, then your dexterity. You can more or less ignore perception. So that's more or less what tanks need to look for. So for healers, what you're going to look for, obviously wisdom. You need magic, you need cooldown speed, you need mana regen. Very important things for healer. That's the number one thing. You're going to try to get that 270 if you can, if you have the stat points for it. But again, every single one of these stat points affects your base damage, which affects your tanking and healing ability as well. So you still want to try to have your stats as balanced as you can possibly get them and try to get as many stat points as you can. Okay? But once you get your wisdom set up to where you need it for your build, after that you're going to look for dexterity. So dexterity, again, is your crit. We've been over that. That affects crit healing as well. So what critical hit is that's the judge of whether you're going to hit your minimum damage or your max damage. The higher your critical hit is, the higher your chances of hitting your maximum damage or your maximum heal or your maximum block. And then for healers, after you focus on wisdom and dexterity, you might want to spec into some strength. You might want to spec into some fortitude, maybe, because you don't want to be too squishy. And healers are notably known for being squishy. So once you get the stats that you need the most, so dex, I would say try to get it to 60 if you can. Try to get your wisdom to 70, your dex to 60, and then just dump whatever you have left into either strength or fortitude. I would recommend strength because that's going to make you more survivable. The higher your health is, that means that you can survive more of like a one shot or something might not one shot you if your health is high enough. And that's also going to be, so if I take a point out, you can see that's affecting my defense. Defense and endurance is huge in PvE. Evasion isn't as important. So I would recommend speccing into strength over fortitude, because fortitude, while it does affect defenses, it affects endurance, everything like that, it's not giving you any health. And health is a big factor in survivability, so I would prioritize strength over fortitude for a healer, just because of that extra health bump will keep you alive better. That also will affect your own health recovery and things, because it's all percentage based for the most part. Now we're going to go into the damage end. For damage dealers, dexterity is your most important stat for PvE. For PvP, it's going to be perception and dexterity, but we're not talking PvP, so dexterity is going to be your highest, most important stat, and you're going to want that to be your highest base stat too, so you don't have to put a lot of points in. So if you notice, if I take 1 point out of my dexterity, my base stat is really low because I don't have, I'm missing a couple pieces still from my build to fully balance it out. That'll come in time. But because my dexterity is so low, if you put 20 points into any stat, getting one more point after that is going to cost you 2 points, as you can see there. Okay? So because my dex is lower, it's, 20, it's more than 20 points below the 60 mark. So because of that, I'm having to use 2 stat points just to raise it 1 point. Now, I'm not going to keep it like that forever, of course, because, well, I need to still get the other pieces of my gear and get all my gear. As you can see over on the right side, I don't even have everything fully leveled up yet. So that'll fix most of that problem on my build. But just so you know, so if you're, let's say, if your dex or any other stat is, you only have 20 for your base stat, so that's, just your armor and your runes, things like that. Not the points that you got from leveling. So not the stat points you got as you were, leveling your character up and things like that. So if I take all the points out of strength, for example, I am stuck at 41. Now that's the points that I have from my armor, from my rune synergies, that kind of thing. Now, since it's at 41, we'll use that as the example. So if I want to take it up to, say, 61, I can do that. It'll only cost 1 point. But if I wanted to then take it to 62, getting it from 61 to 62 is going to cost me 2 stat points. That's not good. You don't want that to happen. That's very bad. And then if it's a 30 mark, so say, okay, let's just say my strength is at the 30. Okay, that's my base strength is 30. So if I want to get my strength up to 50, that's only 1 point apiece. But then from 50 to 60, it's going to cost 2 points each. Okay? So from 30 to 40 to 50, 1 point per point. But if I'm trying to get strength from 50 to 60, it's going to cost now 2 stat points per point of strength. But if I want to, say, get from 60 to 61, that's now going to cost me 4 points. So after the 20-point marker, it's going to be a 2 stat points per point. And then after the 30-point marker, it's going to be 4 stat points per point. So that's another reason you want to try to keep your stats as balanced as possible, but you still want to spec into your main stat. That way, you don't have to worry about spending extra points, and if you do, it's going to be a dump stat that's not quite as important anyway. Alright? So the goal as a damage dealer is to get to that 60 or 70 point on dex. Try to get to the, if you can, of course. So then after the dex, the next 2 most important things are going to be your wisdom and your perception. Now, perception gives you hit chance. Now, again, not as important in PvE, but there will be some situations and even mobs, like with your light attacks, for example, with your weapon attacks, your basic attacks, your light attack, whatever you want to call it. You can miss if your hit chance is too low. It's not with your abilities, but just with your light attacks. So you can miss, and you don't want to miss, so it is still better to have pretty decent hit chance. Since most of your damage is coming from your dexterity and just stat points in general for your base damage, but since critical hit is the most important, you're going to want to mostly spec into that. You also want to get your strength up to 50, because that's where you're getting your 100 heavy attack bonus from in your stats. So once you get your strength to 50 and your dex up to where you need it to be, you're going to want to spec mostly into perception and wisdom. Now, I would say that wisdom might be a little bit more important, except for the fact that once you get it up to 50, it's not really going to have a huge effect on your overall damage output, but that can also be said for your perception. That range is very helpful, buff duration is pretty helpful, that kind of thing, but the hit chance you get at the 60 mark is going to be better for PvE or PvP than it is for PvE. But as long as you have your dexterity and your strength where they need to be, I mean, 50, just generally speaking, 50 is the go-to for the top 4 stats here. If you can get all of those to 50 plus, that's good. Alright? So when you get that set up, wisdom is very important because it's going to give you your max magic and your mana regen and cooldown speed. Now those are important because, like I said earlier, cooldown speed, let's just get into some of the stats. So things like attack speed. So if I come into here, you'll notice that there's no attack speed buff there. But if I come up to my dex, you'll notice that that's where attack speed is. So it's not just your critical hit, it's also your attack speed. That's one of the reasons dex is so important. So the faster you can attack, the more damage you can deal. Same with your cooldowns. The faster and more often you can cast your abilities, the more damage you will deal. But again, wisdom is kind of a slept-on stat because a lot of people think, well, maybe I'm a melee, or maybe I'm a healer or a tank. I don't really need as much wisdom. Well, yes, you do. Because you can cast more abilities, that's more buffs, more debuffs, more taunts, more heals, whatever it is that you're doing for your build. Wisdom is a big factor, because again, cooldown speed and regen. If you're running out of magic, well, you can't cast any abilities. You can't heal, you can't taunt the boss, you can't deal damage. So the more mana regen, the more max magic, and the more cooldown speed you have, that's going to greatly affect your damage output, as well as healers and tanks and their ability to do their jobs. So dex is the most important, then try to get your strength up. Now, strength, if you're a solo player like me, I do a lot of solo content. I go into dungeons and things. I don't like to have groups. I like to do it by myself. So you're going to need more survivability. And if you want to be if you're trying to be god mode in like co-op dungeons and trials, raids, boss fights, that kind of thing, if you want to survive the really heavy hits, you want more health. Health is very good, okay? Now, just because the health is... Now, before I go farther, the reason my perception is so high is my base perception is at 59, so I literally can't low it anymore, so I just put 1 point into that so I have the hit chance, just so when I go and do PvP I can do a little bit better. But the goal is eventually to get my perception on my PvE build down to around 50. I'm going to try to get my strength and I'm going to try to get my fortitude up to 30 and my strength up to 60. That's the goal. But enough about me. I'm not really here to talk about my build because I still want to have a competitive edge. I'm here to help you. So, what we're going to do is, the health is important, the magic is important, but not as important as dex. So, I would say after dex, strength and wisdom are probably going to be your 2 most important stats to put points into. Again, strength is your defense and your health. That's going to keep you surviving the heavy attack. So if a boss hits you with a heavy attack, but you don't have enough health to survive the hit, it doesn't matter how high your defense is. If he takes out all your health, you're dead. So the more health you have, you can survive a lot of the quote-unquote one-shot mechanics if your health is high enough. I'm sure you guys might have noticed tanks surviving a lot of that kind of thing, just standing in damage and not worrying about it. Well, that's just because their health is so high. But you also do get, defense and resistances and things like that as well from the strength. So if you can get your wisdom up and get your strength up, that's great. Now, obviously, having all your stats maxed out at the highest possible number would be the best thing to do, but that's not possible, at least not yet at this point in the game, so we're not going to worry about trying to max things. The goal is to try to get all of your stats as close together as possible, and also take advantage of those tiers at the 30, 40, 50, 60, and 70 point marks. Those tier buffs are very important for every build, so try to make sure that you're utilizing those. But if you don't have enough stat points, you're not going to be able to utilize those, so you're always going to try to find gear, weapons, and such that give you the most possible stat points. So, I've kind of gone over the cooldown speed, attack speed, regen, and mana, that kind of thing. I've gone over the strength, I've gone over the dex. What about perception? Well, you really only need around 40 to 50 points in perception if you're trying to be fully optimized, just because that range is helpful. That's going to help you, even if you're a melee, that range, if you can get that 50 point perk with the range of almost 10%, 7.5, even if you're running daggers, that means that you actually have a longer reach with your daggers. That increases your melee range as well, not just your bows or your staves and things like that. It also helps your melee. So I would recommend trying to get the 50 point at that too, just because that makes you more useful. If you can only be like, you know, an inch away from the boss, because if you get any farther away, you can't hit the boss because he's too far away, that limiting you in combat, whether you're a tank healer or DD, a damage dealer, that's going to limit you, because there's going to be AoEs, there's going to be, you know, certain attacks the boss has that you're not going to want to stand in, and if you can't get away from the boss and still deal damage, or still taunt, or still heal, whatever it may be, that's going to hurt you. Now, healers, it's not quite as important, it's more for tanks and damage. But it still doesn't hurt to have on a healer if you can get it there. But like I said, you're going to prioritize the other things more on a healer. So that range, very useful. Okay, so also you notice at the 40 point, there's a buff duration. We're not getting this for the hit chance. We're getting this for the buff duration and the range, okay? So as you see, if I'm moving, as I move that, I wish I could move it down farther. But that's kind of your CC resistance, things like that. Again, somewhat important. For tanks, not as much for healers or damage, but I can't lower it to 50, which is where I want it. But that range mark is what you're trying to get to. So when you're bobbing and weaving and fight, you'll be able to keep more time on target. You'll be able to keep your buffs, debuffs, taunts, or your damage. You'll be able to keep that going over, you know, you'll be able to have more time on target, meaning that you'll be able to continue that without having to stop. You won't have to block or dodge, roll, whatever it is, run out of an AoE. As if you have better range, you'll be able to keep attacking even while you're moving, even if you're farther away, to get out of some damage. So perception is also very important, but for a damage dealer, not quite as important as these three here. So again, dex most important. After that, it's going to be your strength and wisdom, but perception isn't far behind. So again, the goal is to try to get at least all of these top 4 to 50 plus, if you can. Now, fortitude is very helpful, especially again if you're a solo player like me. I mainly solo stuff. I find that more fun. So if you enjoy that kind of thing as well, if you see that 30 point right there, gives you 100 endurance. Now that is huge. The more endurance you have, and that's what this gives you mostly, is for PvE, the focus is defense and endurance. And that's what fortitude is giving you. It also gives you evasion, but, you know, as well as CC and stun and silence, those kind of debuff resistances, basically. But as a damage dealer in PvE, you don't really need to worry about the debuff resistances quite as much. But the more damage you can endure and the more damage you can defend against, the more survivable you are. A dead damage is dealing 0 damage per second. If you're dead on the floor, you're not attacking, you're completely useless. So if you can't survive a hit, that's not great. And again, the range with the perception will help with that, but the more fortitude you can get, that's going to be kind of your dump stat for a damage dealer, but the more fortitude you can get, the more survivable you'll be, so the more damage you can take without needing a heal or to, you know, block or dodge or run away, right? So even though it's not quite as important as these other stats, it is still important, and plus it also does affect your base damage, so the higher you can get that, the better. So again, once I get my perception fixed, when I get my new gear pieces, I'm going to get my fortitude up to 30, and that'll fix that. And I'm also going to try to get my strength up to 60 if I can. But generally speaking, the closer together you can get all these stats, the better you'll be. Again, fortitude isn't quite as important unless you're a tank, or in PvP it's pretty important. But otherwise, I mean, you don't need to get it up to 50, for example. Would that be helpful? Well, yeah, all stats are helpful, but some are less helpful than others, especially situationally. Okay, so now we're going to get into the actual build. So that's gear and weapons, that kind of thing. So I'm not going to go over my gear and weapons. I'm not even going to show you the stats because you don't need to know. But we're going to get into the full build talk now. And before we do that, I'm just going to say it's okay to look up builds online. That's perfectly acceptable, all right? But just keep in mind, if you're looking up builds online and just kind of copy-pasting over, that might be a good starting point, but that's not necessarily going to be the best for you. Just because someone else is doing really well with their build doesn't mean you'll even be able to use it. Now, it doesn't matter what weapon combination you use. If you know how to use your build effectively, you can use that build in any content. Now, it might not be the best possible. It might not be the meta, the most effective tactics available, which is what meta means. META, most effective tactics available. So, maybe being a greatsword wand user when you're trying to be a damage dealer, I mean, could you do it? Well, theoretically, maybe, but it's not going to be nearly as good as using full damage weapons, if you get me. So, that's not to say you can't do it, it's just to say it's not really viable. I wouldn't recommend it, right? So there's other things that come into the factor too, such as playstyle, internet speed, things like that. Your own, mobility. If you got arthritis, or you're getting a little bit older, or your hand-eye coordination isn't quite as good, the button mashing is going to be a lot harder. So if you're trying to do a build that requires a lot of button mashing, but you don't have fast fingers, or your internet's really slow, you got a lot of input lag, or just lag in general, or your play style is completely different from the person, you don't, it's just not going to work for you as well. Or alternatively, maybe I'm doing something and you copy my build exactly, you might be dog shit with it, or you might actually do better than me because maybe it complements your playstyle more than my build complements my playstyle. So just because you copy and paste a build from someone who's really good, I mean, yeah, you can go to your favorite streamer, your favorite build crafter, but just because they can use it doesn't mean you're going to get the same results. Now, it's a good place to start, but it's not the end-all be-all. Just because, say, Brad is #1 in the world for Throne and Liberty with a dagger bow build doesn't mean that you're going to be able to use his build. For one, maybe you like being up close, maybe you like being farther away. Again, maybe your internet speed is really slow. Even if you get every single stat point exactly the same as he has his, all the same weapons, maybe even use the same aesthetics, that doesn't mean that you're going to be identical to his build. It just doesn't work that way. There's a lot of factors, okay? It's not just as easy as copy and pasting over. Now, that'll give you an idea of kind of where to start, and then you can start, tweaking it from there. But don't think that just because someone is hitting, God mode with their build, that you're going to also be able to hit God mode if you copy them. You're going to want to pick... First of all, you have to understand what your play style is. Think about how you play. Do you generally run up on the bosses? You try to be as close as you can, try to hug the tank so you're getting all the heals, or stay right behind the boss, whatever it is. Do you like to hang out in the back of the room, away from the healers and all the supports? I wouldn't recommend that, admittedly, but, maybe that's your play style. Well, you want to make a build that's going to enhance and complement your play style. If you try to copy someone else's play style, maybe you can learn it, but most people won't be able to. Alright, so you're always going to be at a disadvantage if you can't match the playstyle of the build you're copying, which is why I always recommend just making your own builds. Alright, so I generally like to kind of move around a lot just because I don't like to... I mean, if I can stand still and just eat all the damage, I'll do that, but I don't like to be super close to the boss, but I also don't like to be super far away from the boss. I like to be kind of a medium range. But that's my playstyle. So again, analyze your playstyle, figure out what. So if you like a really close quarters fight, you might consider being a melee fighter. You know, something like a two-handed sword and dual-wield daggers, something like that. Or maybe, put a crossbow or longbow on your back bar, or run a spear, whatever the case may be. But you're going to want to pick weapons that complement the way you want to play. Now, you're not going to want to pick, shitty combinations. Some weapons complement each other more than other weapons. Like the staff wand I have complement each other really well. Daggers and staff also complement each other pretty well. Daggers and the bows complement each other pretty well. So you're going to kind of look at things that work together, have good synergies, right? Abilities that might buff each other. Maybe my dagger abilities buff my bow abilities, just like my wand abilities buff my staff abilities, that kind of thing. So pick the weapons that you want to run and then build around that, okay? Build around your play style. Alright, so if you like to be ranged, pick ranged weapons. Maybe pick a staff and a longbow, or like I did with the staff and a wand, or maybe even a crossbow, right? So you're going to want to pick that first, but when you're looking at the weapons, you also want to look at weapons that have really high stat points. You don't want to just pick a weapon that looks cool. You want to pick the weapon that's going to be the most useful for your build. And whatever is going to be the most useful for your build is, again, it's going to be determined by your play style, your internet speed, your hand-eye coordination, and even what content you're trying to do. If you're doing a lot of solo content, that's going to be a little bit different than a build that's doing mostly team-oriented content. For example, there's two types of damage dealer builds. There's the glass cannon build, and then there's the more self-sustain type build like I run. So you could either go a glass cannon, which is entirely reliant upon your tanks and healers to keep you alive, but you're going to hit way more damage than a sustain build like me might hit. Potentially, at least. So sustain builds are more focused on survivability. Like I said earlier, if you're dead on the floor, you're not dealing any damage. So you still want to have some resistances, but max damage, you're going to have to sacrifice resistances to hit more. So I'm sacrificing some of my damage so that I can stay alive through pretty much anything. Alright, so you can, again, playstyle is a big factor in this. So you have to decide what kind of playstyle you're going to use, and again, build around that. So when you're doing a glass cannon build, you're going to sacrifice a lot of strength and fortitude just for maximizing your highest damage output. Okay? And if you're running a more sustained build, you're still going to do that, but you still want to spec into some resistances so you can go solo dungeons or, go do open world stuff, whatever it is that you're doing, especially if you're doing some of the solo dungeons. They're a little bit newer, but if you're trying to do that stuff, solo builds are the way to go, especially if you're running self-heals with like a wand or a longbow. I do highly recommend doing that if you're planning on doing a lot of PvE. Longbows and wands are great, especially if you don't run with a team or a healer that's good. You can actually run a tank with 5 damage dealers as long as a couple of the damage dealers have some good self-heals. You don't necessarily even need a healer. That said, healers are nice, and especially because they have a lot of buffs and debuffs that come along with them. So, I mean, in a perfect world, you'll have 1 tank, 1 healer, and 4 damage. That's a team of 6, right? So, but you're not always going to get that in random co-ops and, random groups when you're out and about. Or maybe you're playing with some guild members and your main healer's gone that day and you have a lower level guy who doesn't know as much. Well, can you really trust your healers and tanks? Well, you never know. So, I mean, if you do know, by all means, go full glass cannon build. It's perfectly fine to be a glass cannon. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's also perfectly fine to be a sustain build. It's just a little bit more utilitarian, right? The sustain builds are. So, again, it's going to depend on the content, too. If you're doing mostly boss fighting, that's a little bit different than if you're doing mostly mob pulling. There's not a huge difference, but you're probably going to want to have a little bit more self-heals if you're doing large mob pulls because you're getting hit by 30 things at once instead of just 1 thing at once. It's easy to avoid 1 heavy attack. It's not as easy to avoid 30 heavy attacks. So just keep that in mind when you're making your build. And it's the same with your armor. Now, once you pick your weapons, now you're going to want to pick armor that again has really high stat points. So look at it, and what I do when I first start a build is I'll come into the gear list. Now, the gear lists in here in the crafting. This is only gear that's craftable. Not all gear in the game is craftable. Specifically, a lot of weapons are not craftable, like arc boss weapons and certain drops from things. You just can't. You're not going to like some boss weapons and things from co-ops or world bosses. You know, some of that stuff might not be able to turn into a lithograph. You might not be able to craft it. So not everything is going to be on the list, but when you're going down the list of weapons or armor, let's just go to a chest piece for the shits and giggles. So when you're looking down, you can see here, what are the stats? Well, you can see the stat I have equipped has strength and wisdom, but this Auric full plate has strength and fortitude. Well, strength and wisdom are a lot better for my build than strength and fortitude are, so naturally I'm going to lean more toward that. But you're also going to want to click into the options down here at the bottom, and you're going to click on the View Hide Max Stats, because that's going to show you what the full stats are, right? So this Auric Vanguard plate, when it's fully maxed, only has 10 stat points, versus the 11 stat points that the Forgotten Lotus garb that I have on has. So 11 stat points is better than 10 stat points, especially because one of the stats on this Auric is Fortitude, which isn't quite as useful for damage output. Now, if you're a tank, that strength and fortitude is going to be really good. Maybe you will want to run the Auric, right? Because that's going to give you both attack and health and defense, and the fortitude gives you even more defense. So that would actually maybe be a little bit better. But that's going to be based upon your build. So when you're picking your gear, look first for something that has really high stat points. And then also look at the other perks. So like this one, for example, gives you stun chance, damage reduction. This one gives you heavy attack chance and evasion. Well, that's already looking better than your damage reduction and stun chance, right? Especially for a damage dealer. You want more heavy and evasion and more heavy chance. Okay? So if it's only, let's find something that's bad. Like this one right here. Although it has critical and heavy attack chance, it's only got one stat, dexterity. So if I come and look at well, that's 6 points compared to my 11. Is 11 points going to help? Well, I mean, like I said, the crit hit and the heavy attack, that's buffing your base damage. Well, if you're losing 5 stat points, that's lowering your base damage, which means your critical hits and your heavies are also going to suffer. So again, the stat points are going to be way more important than the crit hit and heavy attack buffs that you can get from things. Those are more secondary. So again, always look for the stat points first, and then your crit hit, your heavy attack, your hit chance, whatever else. Now, if you have two, like, for example, when I was up here between the Auric and what I have, one has 10 stat points, the other has 11. They're very close. So then you're going to look at which stats do you need the most. Which stat do you need to raise the base stat of more? Which stats do you need? So, and then you're also going to look, if it doesn't make a huge difference, well, what do you need more? Do you need the mana regen and melee evasion that I have? Or do you need the damage reduction and ranged endurance that this Auric Vanguard has? So that's always going to be kind of the secondary thing you look at, is the extra perks. Then you're also going to look at the set perks. So for example, the Auric has some set bonuses that gives you endurances, or endurances and a little bit of weapon-based damage. But the weapon-based damage is only affected when the fortitude is over 50, so I mean, that's not as helpful. But if I look over at the Forgotten, the set bonuses give you evasion. Well, evasion, not super useful in PvE. And you go down to the 4-piece, well, that is increasing your critical hit chance, but the stat pieces of a lot of the Forgotten Lotus stuff isn't necessarily that good, so it's not really worth the small amount. Even though it's 110 critical hit chance, that's not necessarily better than having a fuckload of stat points. So you're going to have to try to figure out a good balance between those things. So just look through the list of gear. Find a piece of gear that looks really good. Maybe favorite it, right? So that you can see it and look through it and remember where it is. Remember what it is you're looking for. And keep in mind, you can always change out your gear later. You don't have to just keep the same gear. If you have, like I say, if I decide I don't want to use my Forgotten Lotus garb anymore, I want to swap to, say, like the Dread Admirals or something, right? Well, I can actually transfer all the XP. So this Dead Admiral is level 0. Well, I can break down my Lotus Garb and infuse it into my Dead Admiral and make my Dead Admiral the same level that the Lotus was. Now, that'll decon my Lotus, but I wasn't going to use it anyway if I'm swapping to a new chest piece, so that's fine. So the only thing you're really losing is the traits, and you can build those back up. It'll just take a little bit of time. So don't be afraid to tweak a build after you've made one. In fact, I would actually encourage you to always be continually tweaking your build to try to maximize your stats as much as possible. So in a lot of RPG games, you'll find that the more you learn about stats and the more gear you find out about, there's a lot of little things that end up adding up over time and make a very big difference in your overall usefulness in whatever content you're doing. Okay? So again, just kind of look through the gear, find a piece of gear that gives you the best number of stats in the stats that you need the most, and then pick something that also has pretty good secondary stats or even set bonuses. Okay? And it's going to be that way with the weapons and the armor. Now, just because, like, for example, if I were to come over here into the auction house just so I can easily compare weapons. So this one, for example, Abyssal. If you look at that compared to the Ebon Archwind, Ebon Soulwind Archstaff, or over here with the Dagon, they all have their own special weapon ability. Now, that weapon ability is very useful a lot of the times, but you're going to focus, again, mostly on the stat points, unless that special ability is so OP that it, is so much better than the stat points that it's worth losing some stat points for whatever perk you can get on your weapon. But 9 out of 10 times, the perk isn't going to be so overpowered that it's worth sacrificing stat points for. Because, again, the stat points is your base damage. Everything is affected by your base damage, everything. So if you're losing base damage, you're basically losing all of your stats. So always focus on the stat points. After that, focus on your secondary stats, which is your crit, your hit, your heavy, your attack speed, your mana cost efficiency, your mana regen, your cooldown speed, things like that. It's very important that you try to balance that out. It's very important that you try to find pieces of gear that complement each other. I've made a rune guide, so I'm not going to get into this super deep. But as you can see there with the rune synergy, it also gives you stat points. And you can open up the rune synergy list, and you can see, what stat points and what secondary things are available for each weapon or gear piece. Now, it's the traits and the rune synergies are going to be different for each piece of armor and weapon, for each gear piece that you have. They're going to be different. Now, all the weapons are going to have the same 3 that are generally the most important, which is your crit hit, your heavy, and your hit. Those are, generally speaking, the traits that you're going to want for your weapons. Now, if you're not planning on doing any PvP at all, you don't need to run hit on your weapons for a trait, really. You could go with something like attack speed or cooldown speed or something like that if it's available, but a lot of the time it won't be. So I generally would just advise you to just go with heavy, crit, and hit for your traits on your weapons. But you also want to balance out those traits and your rune synergies, again, to try to get the most possible benefit from your stats that you can. Now, there are a few other things that are going to come into play, things like food and stuff like that. Food is a very good way to enhance what you've already done with your build, with your stats, with your gear. It helps substantially, but again, it's going to be based on your play style and on the content that you're doing. If you're doing PvP, you're probably going to want to get hit chance food. If you're doing PvE, you're probably going to try to get more crit food. But if you're doing something with fewer people or a newer team, if you're doing solo content or helping some noobs clear some content, you might maybe want to spec into some more defensive food or something to that effect. So again, your internet speed, your play style, the content that you're planning on doing the most, all this stuff is a big factor when you're making a build. So just remember, when making a build, it is okay to copy and paste someone else's build, but don't think that that's the end-all be-all. Don't think that that's going to take you straight to God mode because you copied some guy who's at God mode. That's just not the way it works, okay? Always be tweaking your build. Always look for what's best for you, for the way you play, for how fast your internet is, for how fast your fingers can move. All right? And don't even get me started on ability setups, because, I mean, different people might even have different ability setups. Maybe you're going for a lightning build, maybe a fire build, maybe an ice build. Hey, it's the same with tanks and healers. Maybe you're going for like a self-heal, selfish tank. Maybe you're going for a full buff tank. Maybe your healer is going to have a side of damage instead of a side of buffs. It really is just up to you and how you want to play. Now again, not every build is going to be the meta for the content that you're doing. That's not to say you can't do that content. It's just to say people might get mad at you. It's not going to be the most effective strategy, right? So take away from this video, focus on stat points primarily. After that, because that affects your base damage, then after that you're going to focus on your crit, your heavy, and your hit chance, depending on what you're doing. So I hope that this guide video was helpful. If you have any questions, any comments, feel free to leave them in the comments section. If you play with me in the game, you can message me directly or talk to me if we're in a guild together. I'm more than happy to help people create their own unique builds specifically designed for them. Just let me know what I can help with. I'm probably not going to custom make a build for you through the comments section on YouTube, so don't get your hopes up on that. But that is it for me, guys, and I will see you in the next tutorial video. Have a good time.